Ladies and gentlemen, will you please give a rousing welcome to tonight's finalists. The proposition from Bagnallstown, County Carlow, Presentation de la Salle. And the opposition from Ennis, County Clare, St. Flannan's College. My name is Grania Carr, and I was the Newbridge College Concerned Debates team captain that won the 2013 final. At the time of the debates final, I was coming close to the end of sixth year, after having participating in debating since second year in school. Since winning the Concerned Debates that year, I have been studying law in Maynooth University, an interest that had continued to flourish throughout the debates. The skills that I learned through the debates, through research, drafting, public speaking and persuasion, are all key elements to my law studies, and ones which I could not have developed so much in school without the debates. I also found that the various topics covered by Concern through the debates motions have invoked in me a keen interest in human rights and international law, both topics which I became particularly familiar with throughout the debates. Over the past year, I was the Vice President of the Law Society in Maynooth University, and I am now in the final stage of my second year studies, which is a 4-year course. As many of you may be aware, this year, 2015, has been designated the European Year for Development. It is a year to encourage direct involvement, critical thinking, and active interest of citizens in development cooperation, and to give a better understanding of that its importance is not only for the beneficiaries, but also for European citizens. Tonight's motion that the European Union is failing Africa most certainly fits the brief for the year. So now, before I introduce our chairperson, I would like to say a special word of welcome to Emer McNally, who is an artist who will be drawing the debate for us as it happens. Emer was with us last year and produced an amazing mural that has been hanging in the Concern offices ever since. So we are really looking forward to what she produces this year. So finally, ladies and gentlemen, I am delighted to introduce our chairperson for tonight's debate, who is Emily Logan, the Chief Commissioner of the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission. She was appointed by President Michael D. Higgins on October 31st last year. And prior to her appointment, Ms. Logan served for 10 years as Ireland's first Ombudsman for Children and was also elected as President for the European Network of Ombudsmen. Ladies and gentlemen, Emily Logan.
Thank you, Grania. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I was a little bit worried when I came first that the crowd was so quiet, but good to see the enthusiasm. I'm delighted to be here, and it's great to see such a crowd. Concern tells me that 134 schools from around the country took part in this year's debates. So it's great credit indeed to both teams that they managed to get through 134 schools. I'd also now like to begin by congratulating both of our national finalists to say how much we're looking forward to the debate between Presentation de la Salle, Bagnallstown in County Carlow, I like the screaming, and who'll be proposing the motion that the European Union is failing Africa, and from St. Flannan's College in Ennis, County Clare, who'll be opposing the motion. So your team members from Presentation de la Salle are Team Captain Brianna Walsh, Second Speaker Caoimhe Cummins, third speaker Beatrice Kelly, and fourth speaker Saoirse Power, with team coach and mentor Ita Doyle. And the opposition team, St. Flannan's, the team members are Nina Koskinen, Oisin Ross, Jason Herbert, James Gormley, and team coach and mentor is James Delaney. On behalf of everyone present, we'd like to extend our very best wishes to both teams this evening. Now, no debate could happen without judges, so I'm very pleased to introduce before you our five well-experienced and well-travelled adjudicators who are here with us this evening. You have a programme on your seat. You can see some detailed information about your judges. And I'd like to introduce our chief adjudicator, Oliver Smith, who's a 20-year veteran. I don't think that's 20-year-old veteran. Oliver, would that be right? 20-year veteran of the concerned debates. And he'll be assisted by Linda Golden, Patrick Huff, Peter Byrne and Kim Boyle. Ladies and gentlemen, your adjudicators. Over there in that quiet corner in the back are our timekeepers, and no debate could function without our timekeepers. But tonight we have two timekeepers, Kelly Coughlin from Mercy Secondary School in Kilbeggan and Anne-Marie Doyle from Coláiste de Bhríde in Carnew. You're welcome. In terms of the rules, I've been asked to give you some guidance on the speaking tonight. As you know, each speaker is now allowed 4 minutes and 30 seconds to speak, after which time penalties will be imposed. So the first bell will ring at 3 minutes, and the second at 4 minutes and 15 seconds. You, the audience, then will have an opportunity to participate in the debate during the open forum session, which will happen after we've heard all of the speakers. So I'd ask you to respect your teams. It's difficult being up here under the lights. It's a tough thing to do. So respect your teams, treat them well, and wait until that open session to have your say. We encourage you to tweet. The hashtag for tonight is #debates2015. So tweet away. I'm not sure about the rules on photography on phones. I presume we can take... Sorry, I've always been a bit of a rule breaker. It would be terrible not to take photographs of the debate, wouldn't it? So that's #debates2015. So, captain of the proposition, behind, I would like now to introduce Brianna Walsh, the captain of Presentation de la Salle. In the run-up to tonight's final, we asked each of the debaters to fill out a questionnaire, and under the "tell us something interesting about you," Brianna told us that she's got 9 A's in her junior cert. Yeah, but wait for it. She's incapable of making dinner or tidying her room. So Brianna, who's a transition year student, says that she'd like to make a career either in journalism, media, fashion or law, none of which require any cooking. So ladies and gentlemen, I call on Brianna to propose the motion that the European Union is failing Africa.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, fellow debaters, adjudicators and chairperson. My name is Brina and I am proud to captain the proposition tonight, myself and my teammates Caoimhe, Beatrice and Saoirse, here to convince you all in supporting the motion that states the European Union is failing Africa. The European Union, EU, according to the Cambridge Dictionary, is the organisation since 1993 through which European member governments make decisions and agree on action in social and economic matters. The Oxford Dictionary described failing as being unsuccessful in achieving one's goal. This motion states is failing, so refers to the present tense. According to the National Geographic, Africa is the world's second largest continent, holding 54 countries and 1.1 billion people. It's also the world's poorest and most underdeveloped continent, despite holding valuable resources. What we will argue tonight is that the European Union, this organisation of European governments, is currently unsuccessful in reaching its goals for Africa, this massive underdeveloped continent. Their goals are, according to the European Consensus for Development, the eradication of poverty in the context of sustainable development, including pursuit of the Millennium Development Goals. To fail Africa is to fail at these goals, and we will prove the EU are doing exactly that. Caoimhe will tell you about the MDGs the EU are failing to achieve. Beatrice will inform you that the main assistance the EU give Africa, foreign aid, is not sufficient nor the answer. Finally, Saoirse will talk about education, the key to reaching these goals, and how the EU's contribution to it is simply dismal. For this motion tonight is not all about actions, it's about results. In an exam, you can all try as hard as you can, but the sad fact is if you don't get 40%, your own set goal, you have failed. If the EU and Africa aren't hitting their set goals, they are failing the continent. And the UN states the MDGs and poverty eradication aren't being achieved, which Caoimhe will discuss. As for sustainable development, helping Africa now so it can independently help itself in the future. The UN admitted since 1992 it has remained hard to achieve for many African countries. But how do we expect these goals to be reached when the EU's efforts in doing so are sometimes more harmful than helpful? The EU gives lots of money towards development in Africa, but German government's Africa Commissioner Gunter Nuck explained the EU economic trade agreement with Africa cancels out these efforts, being unfair to Africa and benefiting the EU. The World Economic and Social Survey 2013 states climate change is a main challenge to achieving the MDGs, yet the EU are helping spend $88 billion annually on fossil fuel exploration, according to Overseas Development Institute. Jan van der Mortel, co-architect of the MDG, says the EU goals can be reached through the 3 Gs, growth, governance, and grants, or aid, which Beatrice will discuss. As for governance, Euractiv.com hit the nail on the head, describing the EU's approach to governance assistance in Africa as weak, inconsistent, and contradictory. Even though the BBC states the day when corruption stops in Africa is the day we wave goodbye to poverty, wars, AIDS, etc. Growth-wise, to quote the UN, progress is needed and much more needs to be done. The UN Development Programme warns the economic growth rate of Africa is so slow at current, it'll take 150 years to reach goals set for 2000. And van der Mortel admitted progress now is slower than in the 70s and 80s. The EU has to stop being part of this massive problem before it can even attempt to try and solve it. For it's not just about the good we do for Africa, it's about the bad we should stop doing. Until then, the EU is, and always will be, failing Africa.
And now, to oppose the motion, I'd like to invite Nina Costello, Captain of St. Flannan's College, to address the House. Nina's in 5th year and tells us that, wait till you hear this, she's kind of multilingual. In addition to speaking English, she speaks Portuguese, Finnish, French, Irish, and she's currently studying Japanese. She tells us that the people that she admires most are tall people because she likes to look up to them. Ladies and gentlemen, that won't be me, to oppose the motion, the captain of St. Flannan's College, Nina Costigan.
Chairperson, adjudicators, members of the proposition, ladies and gentlemen, we vehemently oppose this motion. We largely accept Brianna's definition of the European Union, but interestingly, the proposition cautiously omitted the citizens of the EU, who play a large role in donating to African development projects. Brianna further avoided including NGOs, but they are inextricably linked to the EU's efforts in Africa due to funding from the European Commission, as stated by Concord, the European NGO Confederation. Moreover, the Dolman County proposition conveniently left out several programs, such as the Pan-African Programme, the 2000 to 2020 Cotonou Agreement, the Joint Africa-EU Strategy, or JAES, and the AU-EU partnership between the African Union and the European Union. All these strategies are proof of the partnership that exists between the EU and Africa, aiming to address global challenges and achieve sustainable development, according to the 2014 AU-EU Summit report. The verb to fail originates from the Latin fallere. Brianna defined failure as being unsuccessful in achieving one's goal. But the Cambridge English Dictionary states that to fail means to not help someone when you are expected to do so. Whilst we accept, Brianna, that the EU may not have been 100% successful, this does not equate to failure. The proposition are proportioning the blame almost entirely to the EU. But there are other issues that we must juggle with and cannot simply cast aside, such as the ongoing recession in Europe, African exploitation, and the impact of other global powerhouses, such as Russia, China, the US, and Australia. Is failing is the continuous present tense, which means that it includes ongoing actions that began in the past, according to the Oxford English Dictionary. We will look back 22 years, as far as the formation of the EU, in order to take into account the legacy the EU has left and is leaving through its work in Africa. To define Africa, referred to as the land of opportunity by the UN, the Population Reference Bureau states that it has a rapidly growing population, which comes with many challenges. However, many of these are worsened by corruption and misconduct perpetrated by Africans on Africans, as the Council on Foreign Relations reports. The EU cannot be expected to solve all of Africa's problems. This would lead to accusations of neo-colonialism, which was highlighted by Global Policy on the 19th of August last year. Despite these difficulties, the International Monetary Fund estimated last year that 7 of the world's 10 fastest growing economies were African, refuting Brianna's image of Africa as a destitute continent. As our theme tonight, we will give you the very best of Toto's Africa. And as our team sees it, Toto stands for throw out the old, this outdated image of Africa and failure. To quote the infamous lyrics, "It's gonna take a lot to drag me away from you." And just like the relationship Toto sings of, we have a hypothesis that the relationship between the EU and Africa is one of commitment, development, and growth. We will categorically prove this through our team's points. Our think tank machine, Oisin, will reveal the progress that has been made in education, proving that EU projects have been successful. He will show the improvements in healthcare that have come about with the support of the EU. Oisin will also highlight the humanitarian aid the EU delivers to Africa, improving the quality of life for many, which is in stark contrast to the failure the proposition is labelling the EU with. Jason, our fiery redhead, in denial, will illustrate the European Union's role in the expansion of the African economy. He will prove that trade deals between the EU and Africa have benefited the continent and have not failed. Jason will also demonstrate the success of the EU in improving infrastructure in Africa. Finally, James, our illustrious fourth speaker, will show Ireland's role in aiding Africa despite our economic situation. He will highlight the part the EU plays in peacekeeping in conjunction with UN and African peacekeeping forces, which is not indicative of failure. As an African proverb states, however long the night, the dawn will break. Africa is rising, and the EU is committed to supporting this. Defeat this motion.
Our second speaker for the proposition is Caoimhe Cummins, who's in transition year, and she tells us that her abiding memory of the debates this year was being behind the podium and knowing that everyone in the room is listening to a young person's opinion. She's learned that once you have a reliable source, people will definitely want to hear what you have to say. And so, to continue proposing the motion, I invite Caoimhe Cummins to address the House.
Ladies and gentlemen, fellow debaters, adjudicators and chairperson. In 2000, the UN created the Millennium Development Goals in hopes to address the least developed countries' specific needs. These MDGs are also one of the EU's main targets to be achieved this year. Before I begin, I'd like to refute Nina's definition. The word failing is defined as not succeeding in what you are trying to achieve by Merriam-Webster, Macmillan and Collins dictionaries, respectively. The first MDG was to eradicate extreme poverty and hunger. Now, as defined by Oxford Dictionary, to eradicate is to remove completely. The EU marked the goal off as complete because extreme poverty levels were halved. Yet, according to a UN report, the amount of people living in extreme poverty in sub-Saharan Africa rose from 290 million to 415 million in just 20 years. The EU claims to have assisted 46.5 million people with food in the third world. Yet, according to UNICEF, a person still dies every 3 seconds from starvation. At the current pace, the EU will not see the eradication it pledged to achieve until 2147, according to OECD. You see, Nina, as the European Commission themselves concluded, most developed countries are not projected to reach the MDGs, and sub-Saharan Africa lags very much behind. The EU have failed to achieve the second MDG, to achieve universal primary education. They themselves admit that giving all African children an education will be a challenge, as Saoirse will later elaborate on. Another MDG that the EU have claimed to achieve is to promote gender equality and empower women. But please tell me, how can they consider this goal to be achieved when only 61 girls for every 100 boys attend secondary school, according to Brookings Institute? When, according to UNICEF, in Africa 40% of women aged 20 to 24 were married as children. When, according to endfgm.eu, 8,000 girls per day are at risk of having their clitoris or labia cut off. In consonance with this, the fourth MDG is to reduce child mortality rates. According to the WHO, 612,000 African children die annually, as children in sub-Saharan Africa are 15 times more likely to die than children in other developing regions. The UN have repeatedly stated that child mortality is easily preventable, yet according to UNICEF, at the current pace, the EU's goal will not be reached until 2026. MDG number 5, improve maternal health. According to the WHO, in Africa, 480 women die daily from preventable causes. Only 46% of African women receive professional assistance during childbirth, according to the NIH. Keeping with the topic of health, MDG number 6 was to combat AIDS, malaria and other diseases. While thankfully there were decreases in deaths, 1 million people still die per year of AIDS, according to UNAIDS.org. 90,000 Africans die annually of malaria. 90,000 lives that could have been saved for just €1.80 a day, as stated by UNICEF. The EU claim that they have ensured environmental sustainability, but they have failed, as according to UNICEF, a child dies every 15 seconds from dehydration, poor sanitation and poor hygiene. Along with, as stated by the WHO, an increase in the amount of sub-Saharan Africans without access to clean drinking water. So really, what have the EU achieved in Africa? The 8th MDG was to develop a global partnership for development. Unfortunately for Africa, according to the African Development Bank Group, ODA to developing countries declined by 4% in 2012. Nina, to quote the Italian Prime Minister Matteo Renzi, the EU's work is simply not sufficient. Europe is a very talented student that does not work hard enough. The EU can sign as many pledges and set as many targets as they like. Without substantial results, their efforts simply aren't good enough. Their efforts are simply failing.
Oh my God, he's here, he's ahead of me. Our second speaker for the opposition is Oisín Ross, who's also in transition year. His advice to anyone considering taking up debating next year is to most definitely give it a go and practice refuting a lot, trying simultaneously to be destructive and nice. Oisín, here's your chance to show us how it's done. Ladies and gentlemen, to oppose the motion that Europe is failing Africa, I give you Oisín Ross.
Education is the most powerful weapon we can use to change the world. Nelson Mandela. Ladies and gentlemen, the UN, April 2015, noted that the number of African children enrolled in primary schools since 1999 has increased by over 75%. This can be contributed to the €2.5 billion annual support, as reported by the European Commissioner for Development in September 2015. The NGO Concord acknowledged that the EU has provided over 9 million African children with access to schools and primary education. Primary school enrolment is one of the Millennium Development Goals Brianna and Caoimhe spoke of. We need to throw out the old, this idea of failure. In 2012, the EU spent its Nobel Peace Prize on the Children of Peace initiative. The Norwegian Refugee Council 2013 states that this has provided 14,000 African children of war with access to schools where they can learn in safe environments and receive essential psychological support. The EU is doing their very best to carry through these Millennium Development Goals. And this also proves, to quote my idol, by working together, we can get the job done. Bob the Builder. Caoimhe, on health. Infant mortality rates in Africa dropped by 49% from 1990 to 2013. That is nearly half. UNICEF, February 2015. According to the Red Cross, the EU assisted this through its fight against malaria. In 2002, the EU funded, and now largely finances, the Global Fund to tackle AIDS, TB, and malaria, all Millennium Development Goals. This has provided over 450 million insecticide-treated mosquito nets. WHO, April 2015. The Liberian Minister of Foreign Affairs, on the 29th of April 2015, thanked the EU for its prompt response and the €1.2 billion it made available to combat the Ebola crisis. And now Liberia is Ebola-free, as reported by the WHO just last Saturday. Médecins Sans Frontières, if you'd excuse my French, reported on how the EU funded the discovery of a cure for Ebola, proving that the EU's relationship with Africa is one of commitment, development, and growth. To quote Toto's Africa, I hear the drums echoing tonight. Echo. The European Commission's Humanitarian Aid and Civil Protection Department deals urgently with crises caused by natural disasters or human activity. ECHO has never failed Africa in a time of crisis. The EU is the world's largest provider of humanitarian aid. And don't worry, I won't go full Bono on this. ECHO funded CONCERD's Ethiopia Emergency Nutrition Project in 2011. All Africa reported on the 16th of February 2015 on ECHO aid of 32 million to Mali, 36 million to Chad, 55 million to Senegal, Mauritania, Burkina Faso, Guinea, Niger. The list goes on and on as ECHO reverberates across Africa, proving that the EU's relationship with Africa is one of commitment, development and growth. Defeat this motion.
Allow me to introduce you now to Proposition Speaker 3. Beatrice Kelly is in fourth year. She says her favourite debate motion this year were pledges by world leaders to achieve greater gender equality by 2030, our utopian pipe dream, and the West is to blame for the rise of Islamist State, because they're both such prominent and difficult issues. Her favourite quote from this year's debate is Nobel laureate Wangari Maathai: "The higher you go in society, the less women are there." Ladies and gentlemen, to continue proposing the motion, Beatrice Kelly.
Ladies and gentlemen, fellow debaters, adjudicators and chairperson, the opposition's argument tonight is understandably alluring. The idea that hundreds of millions of Africans are striding into the middle class because of the EU is certainly a refreshing antidote to the images of death and deprivation. But much like the opposition's argument tonight, it is a romanticised idea. Nina, you can name as many plans as you want, but recent OECD figures show that the EU is the world's biggest donor of development aid. But NGOs say that this is not enough, and they call on the EU to do more. According to EU Aid Explorer, the EU gave their most money to African countries last year. According to Transparency International, these leaders that were given billions of euros were on their list of the most corrupt governments in the world for 2014. According to Europa.eu, aid is audited and corruption is monitored. But in fact, as stated by a security consultant for the EC, money is given to a state, but they are not always required to provide proof of proper utilisation, which according to Euractiv leads to many of the EU aid projects examined by the European Court of Auditors falling short of delivering, failing. Nina, you spoke of the past. Well, according to Euronet, only 4 out of the 28 EU members have reached the 0.7% target outlined 10 years ago. The EU are simply failing. Oisin, the EU are trying their best. Well, according to NGOs, they are not. Tell the thousands of Africans dying on a daily basis that they are doing their best. Tell the thousands that are dying of hunger, oh, they're doing their best. Nina, how can you say that Africa is growing? Yes, countries have recorded economic growth, but a highly unequal distribution of income prevents this growth from having a positive impact on poverty, as stated by The Guardian. Nina, according to Europa.eu, the EU have failed to give the money they pledged since 2003. And according to Dvex.com, they are again cutting NGO and EDF funding in 2015, despite Plan International's urge to EU leaders to, quote, protect the EDC budget from severe and unjustified quotes. Nina, according to The Guardian, much of the overhyped economic growth is fueled by the exploitation of oil and gas, which according to FOE is carried out by many EU countries.
Ernesto Ciroli, an Italian NGO worker, put it perfectly when he said, instead of throwing billions at corrupt leaders, the EU must help Africa to help themselves. Nina, just because some African economies are reaching an annual growth rate of more than 6%, this does not mean that the lives of the average citizens are improving, as wealth disparity is rising even faster, as stated by The Guardian. Oisin, your facts are the very same as me taking a glass of water from a swimming pool and saying it has decreased. A baby would still drown. According to IPS News, Africa is one of the richest parts of the world when it comes to natural resources. But they are the poorest when it comes to their people, according to worldbank.org. Because as stated by Global Policy, 170 billion euros leaves Africa every year. 40 billion from multinational companies, some of which are European. 18 billion from debt repayments from corrupt leaders to EU banks, as stated by The Guardian. 16 billion from illegal logging and fishing, which FOE have stated is carried out by EU countries. 30 billion from tax evasion, with much of the money being held in EU banks, as stated by The Guardian. 32 billion from climate change, which the BBC have said Africa is the least to blame for. The EU are failing their goals. They are simply failing Africa. Propose this motion.
Allow me to introduce you to opposition speaker number 3, Jason Herbert. Jason is in transition year. He says the person he admires most is Nina Koskinen, his team captain. He likes long walks on the beach and says that the debates have made him, don't connect the two, come on, and says the debates have made him more interested in current affairs. If he could change one thing about the concerned debates, it would be to allow more time for refutation. Jason, you have 4 minutes and 30 seconds to oppose the motion. Ladies and gentlemen, Jason Herbert.
Ladies and gentlemen, we must throw out the old idea that Africa is failing. The relationship between the EU and Africa solidifies commitment, development, and growth. According to the UN, good transportation is vital to reduce poverty and hunger, which is why the European Development Fund shows that €7.4 billion was spent on building modern highways in countries such as Mali, Uganda, and Ethiopia from 1995 to 2011. Beatrice said that aid is not direct and effective enough. However, the EU Observer in April 2014 showed almost 50 infrastructure projects funded by the EU, representing a total value of over $4.5 billion. This includes the Lake Victoria Water and Sanitation Project in Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda, the Kampala Bypass in Uganda, and the Great East Road in Zambia. Among others, there are 47 other infrastructure projects. I could go on. Does that show the EU's failure? On water, as an OECD report stated, the EU splashed out €1 billion from 2001 to 2010 on improving water sanitation in sub-Saharan countries, according to Euractiv News on the 2nd of October 2012. The EU is doing what 100 men or more could ever do. Do. by financing 21 energy projects to the sum of over 125 million euro. This includes hydro, wind, solar, and biomass projects across 9 African countries. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm no Eddie Hobbs like, but I know the African economy is growing due to the EU's help. Brianne stated that the current deals with the EU are unfair and biased. However, Africa had GDP growth of over 5% from 2003 to 2011. This could not have been achieved without the Africa Infrastructure Trust Fund, set up by the EU to attract investors from the private sector into African economies. Does that show the EU's failure? European Investment Bank, November 2012. Brianne said that growth rates aren't high enough. However, in 2012, 8 of the fastest growing economies were African, as Nina stated. This could not have been achieved without the EU, as despite the challenging times, the EU remained Africa's #1 trading partner, increasing imports from Africa by 43.5% from 2007 to 2012, as reported by OECD in 2012. This proves our hypothesis. The World Bank on the 11th of November 2011 reported that most African countries will reach middle income status by 2025 if current growth rates continue. This is only achievable because of current deals with the EU, such as 15 West African states having 100% access to EU markets. Beatrice said that the EU is exploiting African countries. However, how could that be true with current deals such as the one I just outlined? Brianne said that trade with the EU is failing. However, let's compare this to the way China, another powerhouse, does trade. 11 miners were shot by Chinese managers because they were protesting poor wages. Their P-45 was a bullet to the brain. The Telegraph, May 2010. We must throw out the old idea that the EU is failing Africa and welcome the dawn of development and growth. Quiva said that the number of people living in extreme poverty and hunger is rising. However, the EU continues to enhance food security by financially supporting African agricultural institutions and policies, which is eradicating extreme poverty and hunger. 31.9 million people have been assisted in Africa in 9 years due to the EU's help. Quiva said that MDGs have failed. However, child mortality rates have fallen in countries such as Senegal, Rwanda, and Kenya. I'm going to leave that there. To quote Albert Einstein, "You have not failed until you stop trying. Defeat this motion."
Proposition speaker number 4 is Saoirse Power. Saoirse is in transition year and is the final speaker for the proposition. When she leaves school, she'd like to study either journalism or law, and her advice to people thinking of taking up debating is to go for it. You've nothing to lose but your nerves. And she claims that doing the Concern debates has been one of the best experiences of her life. To propose the motion, Saoirse Power.
ladies and gentlemen, fellow debaters, adjudicators and chairperson. While news cameras will never capture a child dying from lack of education, every day thousands of African children die from AIDS, malnutrition and other conditions that would have been prevented had their mother a chance at basic education. I stand in front of you here today because higher powers believed in education was the most important thing that I could be given. I stand in front of you today because not almost 40% of our population are illiterate, as they are in Africa, source UNESCO. I stand in front of you here today because to prove to you that the EU are indeed failing Africa. Nina, you can include any strategies that you want that the EU are involved in Africa. But if you can't provide evidence that they have caused development in Africa, then your point is quite frankly invalid. The EU has set out goal after goal for education, and it has failed miserably every time. A trend for not only education, as Quiva will have proved. The opposition tonight know that sustainable development is one of the EU's main goals in regards to Africa. But as according to the UN, Africans' insufficient access to education has undermined EU's efforts to achieve this goal. How can Oisin state that the EU are not failing Africa when an International Monetary Fund World Bank study recently concluded that at current trends, sub-Saharan Africa will not achieve the EU's MDG of primary education until at least 2061. The basic right of primary education will not be achieved until 2061, yet the opposition tonight believe we are not failing Africa. Oisin, you have stated that 90% of African children are enrolled in primary school, but the results monitoring for MDG2 on education enrolment, the equality, content and methods of education as part of the EU are not measured. Therefore, improved access to education signified MDG improvements, but this masked the reality of devastating quality and outcomes as according to UNICEF. Also, according to UNESCO, 19% of children actually enrolled in school will never reach the 3rd grade, and 123 million children will leave without being able to read. How can you say that this is achieved when UNESCO are saying this? The fact of the matter is, the EU can build better education systems. They can ensure quality learning. Instead of the 9 sectors to which the EU gives development aid, have a guess where education lays in terms of its funding. Education, the key to the EU achieving every one of their goals, was ranked least important, as according to Europa.eu. You see, education transforms lives. As according to UNESCO, it improves chances of a healthier life. It reduces poverty and it promotes sustainable societies. Yet the Netherlands has decreased aid to education so much so that their aid to it as a total share of all aid dropped from 23.8% to 2.6%. The Netherlands, a developed, wealthy country, believes that education, the reason I and you can be here tonight, deserves a $1 billion aid slash. Jason continuously makes us aware of lovely anecdotes of what the EU is doing. Although conveniently enough, is failing to mention this motion. This motion is saying that we are currently failing Africa. This is not 2010 or 2011. This is currently. The opposition can stand there with their rose-tinted goggles and romanticize ideas about Africa. But before Africa can develop, both the opposition tonight and the EU need to realize that they need to stop being part of the problem before becoming its solution. Thank you.
podium. So our opposition speaker number 4 is James Gormley. James is in 5th year, and he tells us that his favourite film is The Curious Case of Benjamin Button because it makes him tear up every time. He wants to be a professional musician when he leaves school and spends some time in Australia. Well, before you go, James, there's a small matter of opposing the motion. Ladies and gentlemen, James Gormley.
I bless the rains down in Africa. Well, ladies and gentlemen, one place we most certainly do not bless the rains is here in Ireland. Brianna stated that EU actions are insufficient in Africa. However, Ireland is the single largest aid donor to Africa in the world per capita, according to the OECD. And not only that, Brianna, the Irish Independent on the 27th of October 2012 reported on how Ireland has driven itself further into debt to maintain the €552 million in aid it gives to Africa per year, to keep itself from failing Africa, despite being in a deep economic recession. The Irish Times on the 27th of September 2014 told of Irish aid projects, such as the €208 million spent funding a programme to combat AIDS in Mozambique. And to further my colleague Oisín's point on education, the 10% of its annual budget, Irish aid used to support basic and post-primary education in countries such as Mozambique, Zambia, Uganda and Lesotho. And as we say down in West Clare, Saoirse, now we're shucking diesel. Beatrice stated that the EU simply throws money at problems in Africa. However, the Irish Independent on November 21st, 2014, reported on how 500 Irish EU citizens travelled to Africa with the Niall Mellon Trust to build schools in 2014. This proves our hypothesis that the relationship between the EU and Africa is one of commitment, development and growth. Saoirse spoke of literacy rates. However, adult literacy rates have increased by 25% since the formation of the EU, while female literacy rates have increased at a similar rate, UNESCO. Cueva said that malaria kills 90,000 people a year. However, every 2 seconds, the EU vaccinates a child in Africa, immunising 80 million children, saving 1.4 million lives. And don't worry, ladies and gentlemen, I won't start clicking. Beatrice stated that the EU has donated to corrupt governments. However, international donors, including the EC, suspended over €450 million in budget support to Tanzania, Uganda and Malawi in response to claims that senior government officials took funds from the country's central bank. The Guardian, 13th of October 2014. The EU have a no-nonsense policy when it comes to corruption. Brianna stated that the EU does not work for good governance. However, the EU has promoted good governance through the deployment of 38 election observation missions, as in Liberia, in partnership with the AU, which have ensured transparent and inclusive elections. The JAES Summit 2014, which is James without the M, but we won't go there. The Kenya Today newspaper on October 23, 2013, reported on how the EU is also providing financial support to strengthen AU legal instruments, both in Africa and in terms of international law, further refuting Brianna's statement that the EU supports corruption. A study carried out by the Barcelona Centre for International Affairs found that the EU has directly supported peacekeeping operations in countries such as Somalia, the Central African Republic and Mali to the tune of €743.7 million, and to live out my dream of being a teleshopping presenter. But wait, there's more. The UN has also been a key player in UN peacekeeping operations in Chad, the Congo, Western Sahara, Sudan and the Ivory Coast in terms of funding and manpower. This shows how the EU is committed to promoting development and growth in Africa by maintaining peace, proving our hypothesis. Cueva spoke about Millennium Development Goals. However, the target of halving the amount of people without access to safe drinking water was achieved in 2010, 5 years before the schedule, UN 2014. Progress has been made, and this does not warrant a fail grade. Caoimhe, you stated that the EU has not done enough for AIDS sufferers. However, through its contribution to the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, the European Commission provided antiretroviral combination therapy to 750,000 people at an advanced stage of HIV infection, AU-EU website. Caoimhe, you spoke of the EU failing with... Saved by the bell, Caoimhe. Coming together is the beginning. Staying together is progress, and working together is success. H.J. Ford, defeat this motion.
I would now like to invite Nina Costigan, Captain of the Opposition, who you have already met, to sum up for her team.
To fail or not to fail? That is the question. And the European Union has decided to cast failure aside, to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing them, end them, to paraphrase Hamlet. Chairperson, adjudicators, ladies and gentlemen, if this motion is carried, it is the equivalent of saying that the relationship between the EU and Africa is null and void. The Dolman County representatives have proposed the idea that the EU's efforts are futile, diminishing their achievements almost to a zero-sum game. Brianna, we are not waving the European flag here, saying they deserve all 12 gold stars for their efforts. But ask yourselves this: without the help, aid, and commitment of the EU, where would Africa be? To sum up, I define the motion, highlighting the partnership between the EU and Africa that has allowed both continents to throw out the old, patronizing image of a donor-recipient relationship, contrary, to quote Macbeth, to the tale of sound and fury created by the proposition. To sum up Oisín's points, he illustrated clearly that the EU has opened a multi-dimensional toolbox of solutions by supporting education in Africa, disproving Saoirse's point that the EU has not done enough for education, and showing that they have empowered thousands. Oisín also highlighted the effective actions of the EU in health, as seen in their actions in the Ebola crisis, which were praised by Médecins Sans Frontières. This proves that the EU acts efficiently, contrary to what Caoimhe stated. EU funding and research in malaria, AIDS, and TB has had a significant impact also. Oisín demonstrated that the EU is instrumental in providing humanitarian aid. And despite what Beatrice argued about the disadvantages of aid, the simple truth is that without it, hundreds of thousands more would die. It seems the EU is damned if it does, and damned if it doesn't. In summing up further, Jason proved that it's going to take some time to do the things we never had, in the words of Toto, and that the EU has been successful in improving infrastructure in Africa, which is vital to attract investment and facilitate business. This means Africa will not become reliant on aid, disproving what Beatrice stated. Jason revealed that many African countries have growing economies, refuting Brianna's image of Africa as a destitute continent. As a counter-argument on Beatrice's statement that Europe exploits Africa, Jason clearly illustrated that the EU is Africa's biggest trading partner. And this relationship is only set to improve with a new West African deal, allowing them full tariff-free access to EU markets. Finally, to sum up, James demonstrated the commitment of the EU to Africa's growth through the role Ireland plays in aiding Africa, driving ourselves further into an already crippling debt to maintain this aid. James also showed the involvement of the European Union in peacekeeping and good governance, disproving Brianna's statement that the EU has not done enough. We acknowledge that Africa faces challenges caused by endemic conflicts, Brianna, but cautious optimism is in order. Saoirse stated that we must focus on this year alone. However, the motion is in the continuous present tense, meaning that it includes ongoing actions that began in the past, as I stated. Beatrice, to quote an African proverb, if you think these actions are too small to make a difference, you have obviously never spent a night with a mosquito. Beatrice stated that economic growth in Africa does not help people in poverty. However, to further Jason's point, the EU Council of Ministers adopted on the 14th of November 2011 a strategic framework for the Horn of Africa to support the welfare of the people of the Horn and to help lift them from poverty into self-sustaining economic growth. Brianna and Caoimhe both spoke of the Millennium Goals. While the world may not have achieved all the Millennium Goals, their efforts do not merit a fail grade. For example, by 2012, all developing regions have achieved or were close to achieving gender parity in primary education, according to the Millennium Development Goals report. Throw out this idea that the EU is failing Africa. The EU is not failing. Defeat this motion.
And finally, to close the debate, we welcome back Brina Walsh, the captain of the proposition, to have the last word on the motion that Europe is failing Africa.
Good evening once again, ladies and gentlemen, fellow debaters, adjudicators, and chairperson. My name is still Brina, and my team are still strongly proposing tonight's motion that states, the European Union is failing Africa. We've heard both sides fight well tonight, but the accuracy of this motion is now clear. For how could you side with the opposition? Before I begin, Captain Ina, your speech hasn't left my mind since you began, but for all the wrong reasons. You addressed my definition of to fail as to not help Africa at all, but you've completely ignored the fact that despite the help the EU are saying they're giving, they are doing much worse to stunt this help, cancelling out any success. For example, Charles Agbaga, the Africa Regional Director for the UN Millennium Campaign, says multinational cooperations and the legal structures behind tax havens in EU member states prevent nations from developing and perpetuate a cycle of poverty, what the EU are trying to stop. Their action plans and sanctions have been criticised as too weak, and EU-based tax havens are excluded. Much more needs to be done according to taxjustice.net. They also promised to stop illegal logging, and this has been criticised by Greenpeace as failing, with illegally logged wood still slipping into the continent, causing climate change, stopping sustainable development. Despite saying they're helping, they are failing in the help they are giving, with poor results. You stated the EU are helping to solve corruption, but in fact, as Beatrice stated, the EU is basically funding corrupt governments. You also stated the EU cannot be expected to solve all of Africa's problems. Well, I agree with you perfectly there, because as we've proven, they aren't even succeeding in the ones they are pledging to. My second speaker, Caoimhe, explained how the EU have fallen short in achieving the MDGs. At current, poverty eradication in Africa won't be achieved until 2147, according to OECD, and thousands are dying due to things that the EU pledged to stop by this year. Now, the opposition's second speaker, Oisin, I agree with your inspiring quote. Education is the most powerful tool that can be used to change the world. Yet, as Saoirse proved, universal primary education in Africa won't be achieved until 2061, according to IMF World Bank. You also stated EU are doing their very best, but the UN have already stated progress is not enough and much more needs to be done. You may have also argued that some of the MDGs have been achieved, but that is worldwide. In Africa, where the EU's pledged to achieve the MDGs, not one of them have been achieved there, including infant mortality rates, which according to UNICEF in Africa, as the motion states, won't be achieved until 2026. As for Ebola, it has existed since 1976, according to CDC.gov. Yet it took over 10,000 people to die before the EU tried to find a cure. Will it take AIDS and malaria to cause more deaths to do the same? And don't forget, according to CDC.gov, we have a cure for malaria. ECHO has been described by Maxwell School of Social Sciences as slow, ineffective, and with no logical framework. That explains that the thousands of migrants losing their lives migrating to the EU because the crisis in their own country isn't being dealt with by the EU, despite being the root of the problem. My third speaker, Beatrice, stressed that according to Europa.eu, since 2003, the EU have failed to give the aid they pledged to Africa, and it is ineffective. Jason, you said development is one of the EU's main goals, but also talked about trade. According to Christa Ranzio-Plath, Vice President of the Association of German NGOs, on one hand, EU wants to fight poverty and hunger. On the other, they work against this development with food exports and trade agreements, driving many African farmers into ruins. You addressed water sanitation, yet only 6 EU countries will achieve the water sanitation project in 2015, according to UNICEF. Again, the goal the EU pledged to achieve. Saoirse shocked us with the fact that according to an IMF World Bank study, education, the key to power, is ranked as least important in the 9 sectors to which the EU provides development aid. I would love to finish, but I really don't have time. The motion tonight stands. The EU is failing Africa.
Just while we're waiting, I've just been asked to call on one of the students from Dean's Rath Community College if they could approach one of the staff in concern. Just while we're waiting, thanks. So, ladies and gentlemen, that concludes the formal part of the 2014-2015 final concern debates. I have to say I've never liked myself the notion of thinking about young people only as our future. I think we've a lot to celebrate tonight. Just look at the amazing contribution that young people here tonight and in 134 schools around the country have made. Please show your support for the wonderful evening that we've had here in terms of the information, the education and the entertainment. Please put your hands together.